So today's lesson is over imaginary numbers. And before we talk about imaginary numbers, let's talk about radicals. So a radical is any expression with a square root. So it looks like that. Or a cubed root. It looks like a little 3 there. Any type of square root. So this is the radical symbol. So I'm going to go ahead and list the first 20 perfect squares. And what I mean by perfect square, for example, what's the square root of 1?
1.
Okay, so that's our first perfect square. What's the square root of 4? Okay, so my next one is 4. So these are numbers that if you take the square root of them, you get a perfect number. No decimals, just a perfect whole number. So my next one would be 9. I can easily take the square root of 9. 16, 25, 36, 49, 64, 81, 100. What are the next ones? I'm going to need help with these. 121, 144. What's after this? 156. So guys, use a calculator. Let's do 15 times 15. Let's do 14 times 14. Let's do 13 times 13. And let's get all these numbers. 16 times 16. So what is 13 times 13?
196.
Perfect. What's 14 times 14? 196. Our next one, 225. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Next one is 256. Nice. Next one.
289.
289. Next one. 324. Yep, that looks familiar. Next one. 361. Next one. Oh, 400. Next one is 20. Yep, so 20 times 20, 400. Oh, it's disappearing. There we go. All right, so those are my perfect squares. Make sure you have that copied down. All right, so we're going to talk about how to break down these radicals. We're going to simplify the radicals. So you can have an easy case, which is a perfect square. You just easily take the square root of it. Let's look at some examples where they're not perfect squares, okay? So let's look at the first example, the square root of 112. I can break this down into two numbers. Let's do, what do you guys want to multiply this as? 2 times what will give you 112? 64. Is 2 times 12, or is 2 times 64 112? No, that's not right. 2 times what? Is it 56? There we go. All right, that sounds better. And then what's 56? Can we split this? Maybe 8 and 7?
Yep.
Can we split down the 8? 2 and 4? Can we split down the 4? 2 and 2? Okay, so basically, guys, 112 can be broken down into 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 7, right? 2 times 2 is 4, times another 2 is 8, times another 2 is 16. 16 times 7 will give you 112. Okay, so we can break this. Let's simplify this a little more. 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8, times 2 is 16. So this is basically 16 times 7. If you can come up with these two numbers in the very beginning, that would be great. Okay? So guys, what is the square root of 16? 4. So this is our answer. 4 square roots of 7. Now, it would be great if you don't have to break it down this far into the smallest parts. If you can come up with, oh, 16 times 7 is 112. You can do it that way. Make sense, guys? Okay, let's do the next one. 245. Let's break this down. I'm going to do 5 because I know that 245 can be divided by 5. Can you guys tell me what 245 divided by 5 is? 49. Oh, perfect. That's good. Okay, so let's rewrite this. 245 can be written as 49 times 5. And what's the square root of 49? Perfect. That's your answer. Okay? Yes. Oh, I'm not using the 8 or the 4 because I broke down 8 into 2 and 4. And I broke down this 4 with 2 and 2. So I use the smallest parts. 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 7 will give me 112. Good question. All right, let's move on to number 3. 72. Can we pick two numbers that multiply to give me 72? Let's do 2 and 36. There we go. So I can rewrite this as 5 square root of 2 times 36. And what's the square root of 36? So that means 6 will be on the outside with the 5. So that would be 30 square root of 2. Because there's a 5 already on the outside. So 5 times 6 will give you the 30. All right. Next one, number 4 is 4 square root of 45. So let's break down 45. Two numbers that'll multiply to give me 45. Good, 9 times 5. So let's rewrite this. 4 square root of 9 times 5. And what's the square root of 9? 3. That means 4 times 3 will give you 12 on the outside. And you still have square roots of 5. All right, next problem. Uh-oh. Does everyone have this written down? Okay, great. Let's do number 5. I'm going to erase this. Let's do number 5. Number 5 says square root of 250. Let's break this down. Two numbers that multiply to give you 250.
25 and 10.
Perfect, 25 and 10. So this can be written as 25 times 10. The square root of 25 is 5. So it'll be 5 square roots of 10. That's your answer. All right. The next one is number 6. I'll just write it over here. So number 6 is 3 square root of, wrote it wrong. 578. So let's break this down. Let's divide it by 2. It's an even number. 2 times what will give you 578? 289. Oh, was that one of our perfect squares? Let me go back. Oh, that was one of our perfect squares, 289. So what's the square root of 289? 17. Perfect. Okay, so let's rewrite this as 3 and then 2 times 289. Well, the square root of 289 is 17. So I'll have 3 times 17 on the outside, the square root of 2. And what's 3 times 17? Okay, so your answer is 51 times the square root of 2. All right. Okay, now we're going to move on to the next section. It's called imaginary numbers. So far, guys, we've had the square root of a positive number, right? Now we're going to explore what is going to happen whenever I have a negative number underneath the square root. Okay? So now we're going to talk about imaginary numbers. So the imaginary unit is called I. And it is defined as the square root of -1. We're recording. Okay, so a pure imaginary number is written in the form bi, where b is the real number and I is the imaginary number. Okay, so let's just write that real quick and we'll do an example. Okay. All right, so let's do the steps. Actually, before we do an example, let's look at this top bullet point. Okay, so this top bullet point, it says equations such as this, x squared plus 1 equals 0, have no real solutions. And guys, if you think about it, if we were trying to factor this, what two numbers will multiply to 1 but add to 0? Will 1 and -1 multiply to 1 but combine to 0? No, because 1 times -1 is a -1. So there is no x values that would work for this. The solutions are imaginary. Okay, so that's where we get this from. Okay, so let's move on to an example. Step 1 is to rewrite this square root of -a as the square root of -1 times a. So how do you think we're going to rewrite this first one? Yep, -1 times 9. And in our previous note, on our previous slide, we said that the square root of -1 is I. Okay, this is the key for today's lesson. So guys, what's the square root of -1? I. And the square root of 9 is 3. So this is your answer. The real part goes first, and then the imaginary part, goes second. Now let's do the next one. This will be rewritten as the square root of -1 times 196. The square root of -1 is just I. And what's the square root of 196? 14. That's the answer. And then this last one can be written as the square root of -1 times 5. This will just be square root of 5 with an I. Now notice, guys, I put the I in front this time. Whenever you have a square root, you put the I in front. Now, it's not incorrect to do it like this, but the reason why we avoid it is because a lot of people will make the mistake and put the I underneath, and that's wrong. Okay? So you could write it like this. You won't see it written like that in a textbook. They always put it in front. That's just the format that they want. Okay? Let's move on to another set of examples. Now we have 80, square root of -80. So I can split this into -1 times 80. And let's split up this 80 here. So this will be 80, and we have an I on the front, right? Because the square root of -1 is I. Let's split up this 80. I need two numbers that will give me 80. I'm going to do 16 and 5. Okay, so then this can be rewritten as 16 times 5 will give me 80. The square root of 16 is 4, so I'll have 4i, and then the square root of 5. So that's our answer. Okay, now I heard some of you guys say different numbers than 16 and 5. You could also do it that way. So don't copy this down. I'm just going to show you, just in case you're off doing your homework and you don't think of 16 and 5, you think of different numbers. That's perfectly fine. So let's show you how you would do it with different numbers. You'll still get the same answer. Okay, so I can do i's on the outside, but this can be, I heard someone say 40 and 2. Okay, let's break down the 40. This can be 4 and 10. And then it can be 2 and 5. So that means to take the smallest ones that you broke down. So I'll have I square root of 2 times 2 times 4 times 5. And 2 times 2 is just 4. So I'll just put another 4 here. Oh, and 4 times 4 is 16. Okay, so now let's take the square root. You see how you find it? Okay. All right, let's move on to this next one. This will be rewritten as the square root of -1 times 32. Square root of -1 is just I. And let's figure out how to break down 32. I need two numbers. 8 and 4, good. I would have chosen 16 and 2, but you can still choose this. Let's break it down. 2 times 4, and let's just go ahead and put this in. 2 times 4 times 4. What's the square root of 4? 2. What's the square root of 4? 2. So you get 4i square root of 2. Make sense? Okay, you could have also, let me come over here. You could have also done I square root of 32. You could have done 2 and 16. The square root of 16 is 4, and you just have the square root of 2. So you get the same thing. Okay? All right, let's do the next one. All right, so here we have square root of -1 times 192. So we'll get I, and let's break down 192. Can y'all give me some numbers? Perfect, that's good. All right, so I can rewrite this as I on the outside, and then 64 times 3 will give me 192. Okay, well, the square root of 64 is 8. Then you have a 3. So this is your answer. Nice. Okay. All right, so now, guys, we're going to go on to powers of I. So here's our next set of notes. Okay, I to the 1, well, that's just I. I to the 1 is just I. I is the square root of -1 is just I. That's from our notes. Okay, now let's talk about I squared. Well, remember, guys, the definition of I is the square root of -1. If I square it, the square root cancels out with the squared, so it's -1. Now, I want you to pay attention to this helpful tip. It says break apart into powers of I squared. Okay, so I'm going to write I cubed in terms of I squared. So let me show you what I mean by that. I cubed is the same thing as saying I squared times another I. Does that make sense? Okay. I squared times another I is I cubed. And we just said that I squared is -1. Didn't we say that right here? Okay, so that means this is the same as -1 times I. So that's just -I. All right, let's do the next one. I to the 4th. That's the same thing as saying I squared squared. 2 times 2 is 4. So this is the same thing as saying I to the 4th is the same as I squared squared. And what did we say I squared was? -1. So I can replace this with a -1. And -1 times itself is a +1. Yep, we're going to see a pattern developing. Okay, let's try number 5, I to the 5. I can write this as I squared squared. That would give me 4, but I need 5. So what should I do? Times another I. Okay? I to the 5 is the same thing as I squared squared is 4, but I need 5, so I multiplied by another one. Okay, now let's simplify this. I squared is -1. And what's -1 squared? So this becomes 1 times I, which is just I. Okay, next one. I to the 6th. That's the same thing as doing I squared raised to the 3rd power, right? 2 times 3 will give you the 6. So that's how we can rewrite it. And we said in the beginning that I squared is -1. So this is just -1 cubed. What will that be? -1. So guys, maybe on the side of your paper, write this down. -1 to an odd power is always going to be -1. But -1 to an even power will be a +1. So please write that down. That's important. Here we have -1 to an odd number, to an odd power. That's why our answer is negative. Okay, let's do the same thing again. I to the 7th. We always start with I squared. What should I multiply the 2 by to get close to 7? 3, but that's only 6. So I need to add one more. Multiply by another I. So let's go ahead and simplify this. I squared is -1. Let me highlight what I'm replacing here. I squared is -1. I'm going to write everything else exactly the same. So this will still have a 3 there, and this will be times I. So looking at my note over here, let me highlight it. We're at an odd power this time. Uh-oh, I didn't mean to cross it out. We're at an odd power this time. So what is -1 cubed? -1, and then -1 times I is just -I. Okay, last example. I squared, we always start with an I squared. Now what should I multiply it by to get 8? A 4. And remember, I squared is just -1. This time I have an even power, so my answer is 1. Okay, so let's do example 13. This is I to the 15th. I always start off with I squared. What should I multiply by to get close to 15? 7, but 2 times 7 is only 14, so I need one more to make it 15. Now we're going to simplify. So I squared is just -1, and now it's to an odd power. So it'll be -1 times I, which is just -I. The next example, I have I to the 62. I always start with I squared. What should I multiply by to get close as possible to 62? Oh, that's exactly 62. 2 times 31 is 62. Perfect. So let's rewrite this. This will become -1 to the 31st power, 31st power. And this is odd, so my answer is -1. Okay. All right, do you guys think y'all can do these 2 examples? Okay, so I'm gonna pause here and let you guys do those 2. So guys, the answer for this one was 1, and this one was -I. All right, let's go ahead and move on. Now we're gonna do the products of these. All right, guys, so what's 4 times 7? 28, and what's I times I? I squared, but what did we say I squared was? -1, so my answer is -28. That wasn't too bad, right? Okay. Next one, voices off, please. So now we have -4 times 2 is -8. -8 times -9, 72. Okay, and I have 3 I's, so that's I cubed. Okay, and we can break this apart just like we did in the examples. I always start off with an I squared, and I need 3 of them. So I'm going to multiply by another I. I squared is just -1. So my answer is -72i. All right, next example. Number 19. This says 2i cubed. Well, what is 2 cubed? 8. This means 2 times 2 times 2, that's 8. So 2 cubed is 8, and then I cubed, well, that's just I cubed, times 5i. Okay, 8 times 5 is 40. I cubed times another I is I to the 4th power. Now, when I want to break this down, always start with I squareds. So this can be rewritten as 40i squared squared. Because 2 times 2 will give you the 4. Now I'll have 40 times -1 squared, which is just 1. So this is 40. The step from here to here is 40. -1 squared is just 1. So that's why we just get 40. All right, guys, number 20. This squared will go to each thing in here. So what is I squared? Just I squared. What is the square root of 3 squared? Don't they cancel out? Yep, so that's just 3. And let's do the next one. -8 squared, 64, and then I squared. Now, remember, I squared is just -1. So this is 3 times -1 times 64 times -1. So we have -3 times -64. Can y'all tell me what that is? 192. All right, I just have 2 more examples and then we're done with the notes. All right, so remember this little watch out thing on your notes. We're going to rewrite the negative square root as imaginary numbers first. So guys, square root of 18, this can be rewritten as -1 times 9 times 2. Or actually, okay, fine, you can do that. And then this one can be rewritten as -1 times 10. All right, so let's simplify this, guys. What's the square root of -1? What's the square root of -1? I. Square root of 9? 3. So I have square root of 2 in here. And then square root of -1? I again. Okay, so let's go ahead and combine. I have 3 on the outside. I times I is I squared. Square root of 2 times 10 is 20. We still need to break this down. Let's do this as 5 and 4. 5 times 4 is 20. So let's rewrite this. 3i squared times 5 times 4. What's the square root of 4? Okay, so I'm going to cross this out and put a 2 out here. Okay, so my final answer, 6. And what did we say I squared was? -1. Okay, so this just becomes -6 square root of 5. The step between here was 6. I squared is just -1. Okay, that's how this is my final answer. All right, one last example. One last example. Okay, this one. I can rewrite this as negative, well, what's 24 times 3 times 2? What's 3 times 2? And then 24 times 6? 144. So this is negative times a negative is a positive, times a negative. This is negative 144. Let's just make it one big square root. Okay, now let's break it up. What's the square root of negative 1? Yep. I. And the square root of 144? 12. The answer is just 12i. All right, guys, so that's the end of our notes. We're going to do a little bit of practice now. So stop.